Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the right to disconnect and employment law. Now, Andrew, how can employers adapt to this right to disconnect and the new legislation in Ontario when the nature of their business is highly demanding? For example, I don't think that this legislation would apply to law firms, but for something, but maybe I'm wrong. How can employers adapt when they need employees available outside of the 9 to 5?
Yeah, I mean, Bill 27, the right to disconnect, it doesn't actually change requirements regarding when and for how long employees can work, when overtime kicks in, those sorts of things. That's already in the legislation. So employers can still schedule employees to work outside of the regular 9 to 5. They just need to have a policy which states that employees shouldn't be answering work emails, calls, and those sorts of things when they're off the clock. So I think that's the key thing is, are they off the clock? Will they be paid for this work that they're being asked to do? Even before Bill 27, overtime eligible employees shouldn't have been answering work emails, calls, et cetera. We know that often they do, but they shouldn't have been when they're off the clock. In cases where they are, they're technically entitled to be paid for that time. We've seen this happen a lot more during this remote work era. And I think Bill 27 is trying to address that by making employers draw boundaries and making employees aware of those boundaries.
And just to clarify my question, would this legislation would not apply to law firms, for example?
It would not apply to lawyers.
Right, okay.
Who would be exempted.
Okay.
Correct, yeah.
So, Mackenzie, how would this legislation apply to management? In a high performance environment, even if this legislation applies to you, I know a lot of high performing employees who will, of course, continue to answer emails outside of the 9 to 5. And doesn't this legislation, while well intended, does it create a pressure to just work and then not report those hours?
So I want to be clear, this legislation does not prohibit people from working outside of their normal work hours. So if an employee chooses to go above and beyond, that's not in violation of this new right to disconnect legislation. In terms of management or executives, the Ontario government has been clear that this legislation applies to everybody in your organization. So employers are going to have a policy that will can apply to all of their employees, or they might have different policies that apply to different people in different positions. So employers are really going to need to take a step back and assess what their needs are and determine how many policies they're going to need and how many policies they're going to have applying to different positions.
Andrew, same question if you want to add anything there.
I think it's for more senior employees. I think that it does create, there's a different kind of dynamic for sure, and maybe that multiple policies might deal with it, but there's definitely going to be more difficulty in applying this in certain professions at certain levels.
Mackenzie, I was wondering if you could paint a picture for our viewers about why employees might feel that this type of legislation is necessary. What are some examples of where having a policy in place about right to disconnect might be especially helpful for employees? I mean, what might you be hearing from your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a firm proponent of the fact that employers really need to clearly and properly communicate their expectations of their employees. So this legislation is timely and necessary because it forces those employers to do just that. Particularly during a time when a large percentage of the workforce is now working from home, and the expectations have really changed from the times when they were working in the office. So for employees, come June 2nd, 2022, it's going to be really great for those employees to have a written policy that they can look to, and that should clearly outline what's expected of them in terms of their right to disconnect. And if an employee feels that their employer is not abiding by that policy, they will now have something to point to establish that breach. This legislation also opens up the door for an employee to seek assistance from the Ministry of Labor in enforcing their right to disconnect policy. So I think we will see a lot more employees coming forward with specific breaches of their right to disconnect policies.